Venezuela's deposed leader Nicolas Maduro has arrived in the United States after being seized in Caracas during a surprise U.S. military operation. Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores have been taken to New York to face criminal charges, including weapons trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. They were seized during an overnight raid by U.S. forces that capped months of military pressure on Maduro and his government. In the aftermath of the operation, President Trump said that the United States will, quote, run Venezuela for the foreseeable future, but gave few details on what exactly that might mean.
Mr. President, good morning.
At a press conference from his Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida.
Okay, thank you very much. This is big stuff.
President Donald Trump called the U.S. military operation in Venezuela a huge success. He also surprised reporters by announcing Washington would take over running the country now that U.S. soldiers had captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years.
It's not clear if the U.S. will become an occupying force or install a leader approved by Washington. At one point, Trump seemed to suggest Venezuela's vice president had agreed to help the U.S. run the country.
She had a long conversation with Marco, and she said, we'll do whatever you need. I think she was quite gracious.
But Delcy Rodriguez, seen here in the purple suit next to Nicolas Maduro at his last public appearance hours before his capture in Caracas, gave a live address to the nation soon after Trump's press conference to denounce what she called the U.S. attack on her beloved nation.
Exigimos la inmediata liberación.
We demand the immediate release of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores. The only president of Venezuela is President Nicolas Maduro.
The U.S. released this photo of Maduro aboard the USS Iwo Jima on his way to New York to face drug and weapons charges. Trump, who watched the military attack unfold live from his Palm Beach resort, also says the U.S. will tap into Venezuela's large oil deposits. He says American companies will fix the country's, quote, badly broken infrastructure and start making money for the country.
We'll run it properly. We'll run it professionally. We'll have the greatest oil companies in the world go in and invest billions and billions of dollars and take out money, use that money in Venezuela.
When he was asked how taking over Venezuela and its oil fits into his long-stated goal of putting America first, the president responded, we want to surround ourselves with good neighbors.
Let's bring in journalist Noris Soto now, who joins us from Caracas. So, Noris, Maduro has been brought to New York. How exactly do you think Venezuelans will react to that news?
Hello, Aaron. Thanks for having me. So far, the news is developing. So people are very much in shock. I think that Venezuelans are glued to their phones and waiting for news on what's going on in the country, and also what would happen with Nicolas Maduro. It's really early to see some reactions. Nicolas Maduro has just landed in New York. This is just news of about 5-10 minutes ago. So it's really hard to sense the people's reaction at this moment. What I've been able to sense is a lot of, suspicious, because Venezuelans we're used to a perpetual state of madness and disaster. So at the early hours of this morning, people couldn't believe that this was actually happened. It seemed like a movie from a streaming series on TV. Or a TV show. So it's all been very confusing for Venezuelans. What I can tell you is that Venezuelans have been very cautious on going out on the streets. If they did, it was in the early hours of the morning, just to purchase basic goods to survive any catastrophe or any potential disaster in the country, like basic goods, water, batteries, lanterns, trying to get their cars, the tanks cars full of gasoline. And this has been pretty much the situation in Venezuela as of right now.
All right, so it sounds like very dramatic times both on the ground and also online. But the buildup to last night's military operation was months in the making. Can you describe exactly what you witnessed last night?
It was just that even though the rhetoric was very strong, going back and forth between the U.S. government and Maduro's regime, and also we saw the deployment of the U.S. in the Caribbean and the seizure of tanks, and of course the attacks on these boats allegedly from drug smugglers. Venezuelans didn't think that this was a situation that could end up this way, that Maduro being actually taken out, evicted from the country and taken into custody in the U.S. And this was a very surprising situation, a shocking situation for all of us.
No, of course, we were also shocked here in Europe when the news came through. And also there's the question of the transition now moving forward. Trump says his administration will run the country until a proper transition is completed. Meanwhile, Delcy Rodriguez has been sworn in as president. So the question is, do Venezuelans know who runs their country at the moment?
Well, there are two ways to see this. One would have expected that the elections of the 2024 were respected, where allegedly Edmundo González Urrutia won this election, of course, hand by hand with Maria Corina Machado. We expected that these results were respected, but today Trump suggested that he was willing to work with Delcy Rodriguez for a transition because Maria Corina Machado was a nice woman, quoting, but she didn't have the respect of the people and the support from the military bases. And of course, that's true. That's the case. I mean, Maria Corina Machado has been fighting relentlessly for the freedom of Venezuela, but she doesn't have the support of the military bases, the military forces currently, and the one who has it effectively is Delcy Rodriguez. If you look at the Constitution of Venezuela, it established that if the president can take over because of an unusual situation, the one who should be taking power is the vice president, in this case, Delcy Rodriguez, which has been, in fact, the vice president of the country for the last year or so. And if she can do it, the next one in line is his brother, which is the president of the Congress. This is the Constitution, just plain by the Constitution. So it makes a lot of sense that Trump suggested her as an ally to work with in this transition led by the U.S. government. But what we saw after that intervention, that Trump intervention, was a message from Delcy Rodriguez. And let me say, it was a very radicalized message. It wasn't very much aligned with what Trump said. And it was surprising because she published an international emergency decree. This has to be first run by the National Assembly, the Congress, voted, and then published at the National Gazette. So this is very anti-war. This is very a strange situation. It doesn't seem to align, and one wonders why Trump would suggest her if the Trump administration didn't have an accord or even talks with her beforehand.
All right, now another question in this transition period is what exactly is to become of Maduro's supporters? How exactly are they reacting to him being removed from power? Well,
there were little people on the street. let's be clear, even though he has a lot of rejection from the Venezuelans, he still have a kind of support. He still have a political base. And those were the people we saw on the streets early in the morning, protesting and asking for proof of life. But it was very little compared to the huge manifestations that we saw in previous years, even in the Chavez era. This was nothing compared to that. So one could say how much support he still have, other than the remaining personnel from his inner circle.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That was journalist Noris Soto in Caracas. Thank you very much for your reporting. Let's bring in Phil Gunson. He's a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group think tank in Caracas. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So first of all, with Nicolas Maduro now in U.S. custody, can you give us a sense of what the next steps are for Venezuela?
Well, a lot of question marks still in our minds. Well, number one, now that Maduro appears to be completely out of the picture, will the government that's left behind in Venezuela, which is everybody else except the president, essentially, will that government be able to maintain its grip on power? Will there be divisions? Is this going to lead to some form of regime change, to a gradual process towards free and fair elections, for example? How will exactly the US-Venezuela relationship play out? What Trump seemed to be saying there is that the US is going to be running Venezuela. But of course, there's nobody here to do that. The US doesn't have troops on the ground. Classically, it's very difficult to organize a political transition, a hostile takeover, if you like, of a foreign country if you don't have what they call boots on the ground. There are no US soldiers here. And the government, with the exception of Maduro, remains in power. So, an enormous number of questions remain, and especially because President Trump in that press conference was very dismissive of the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who has been absolutely adamant that once Maduro left, then pretty much automatically she and the candidate who was the opposition candidate who was elected in 2024, but whom the government of Maduro refused to recognize, that they will return and they would assume power. There doesn't seem to be any clear path to that at the moment.
Now, we heard earlier from the U.S. government that Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez would work with the U.S. forces, but at the same time, she held a press conference quickly after that saying Maduro was the country's, quote, only president. So are you expecting there to be resistance to this apparent U.S. takeover?
Yeah, absolutely. They have always sworn that they would resist. I think this idea that that Trump again is presenting, that somehow he's turned Delcy Rodriguez and presumably other members of what is now her government into kind of loyal allies of the United States is rather fanciful. I think when Trump says that he and the US are running Venezuela, what essentially he's telling us is that the Venezuelan authorities will have to do what the US tells them to do. Otherwise, as he said in his initial statements today, there will be another round of bombing, and it will be even worse than the one that was unleashed in the early hours of what is still in Venezuela, what is still today. So it's not exactly a comfortable alliance, and I think it really does remain to be seen what the nature of that relationship is going to be.
Now, of course, it's often said that the U.S. is good at winning wars, but bad at winning the peace. And thinking back to the United States experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, do you think Washington has a plan for a successful transition moving forward?
I don't doubt that there's a plan. In fact, there may be several plans. But of course, there's another saying, which is that no plan survives, a first contact with the enemy, and this is a very tricky situation. There's no clear path to a democratic transition in Venezuela, which doesn't involve an agreement with particularly the Venezuelan military. It's been the military that has sustained the Maduro government. It's the military that will sustain Delcy Rodriguez if she remains in power. And unless that military agrees to a transition, it's not going to happen, because it's quite clear that the US doesn't want to bring in ground troops. There aren't going to be US forces introduced into Venezuela to carry out this transition. So how is that agreement going to be made? How are they going to convince the military to do what they want, bearing in mind that many of the people who lead the military in Venezuela, as well as the civilian administration, are potentially facing, just as is Maduro right now, jail sentences for drug trafficking, for even crimes against humanity. These are not people who are going to be easily persuaded to give up power.
And another question that is on the minds of many right now is, where exactly is the opposition in all of this? We've seen a lot of support both for Maduro and also support for Trump's actions there. So what role is the opposition playing at this moment?
Well, it seems to me that the opposition under Maria Corina Machado has, if you like, outsourced its political strategy to the United States. They essentially went to Washington and said, we can't do this. We can't produce a political transition on our own. And the only way for it to succeed is if external forces come and help us out. So that has made the opposition, in a sense, under Maria Corina, into a sort of an appendage of Washington. They're entirely dependent on what Washington decides to do for its own reasons. And today, Trump was extremely dismissive of Maria Corina Machado, saying that she clearly wasn't the person to lead the country because she didn't have enough support or respect from the Venezuelan people. That's a very curious thing to say about somebody who led the opposition to a stunning victory in 2024.
Now, another question that some people have been asking in Europe is if the opposition was aware of these plans of Trump moving ahead to it. And of course, we've seen this pressure campaign ramping up over the last several months. So do you think the opposition was aware that this strike was coming?
Well, they were certainly aware that it was threatened because Trump was very public about that. He'd been promising or threatening for a couple of months now ground strikes on Venezuela if Maduro didn't step down, if he didn't agree to, as the US would put it, dismantle what they say is a narco-terrorist cartel, not a government. So, there was no secret that it was coming, but there have been several occasions on which the opposition appeared to be absolutely convinced that this was about to happen, and it didn't happen. So there's a big question in my mind as to the extent to which the opposition has really been made privy to the plans that the US has. Is the opposition really a partner of the US in this regard, or are they simply bystanders waiting to see what the US does? Trump has made it very clear that there are very significant US interests involved here. And some way down the list in his list of priorities lies democracy and human rights for the Venezuelan people.
Mm-hmm. And let's stay with the people just for a second. They woke up to a new reality. So is there relief or anxiety on the streets of Caracas?
There's silence for the most part on the streets of Caracas today. People have not wanted to go out on the streets. There have been some small demonstrations called by the government in repudiation of the kidnapping of President Maduro, but opposition sympathizers have mostly stayed indoors. They know the consequences of staging demonstrations on the streets. I think there's a good deal of anxiety. It doesn't mean that people are not happy to see the back of Maduro. I think they are. But they're puzzled and a little disconcerted as to why it is that whilst Maduro may have left, the rest of the government remains intact. And we're hearing from Trump that he appears to be willing to do business with these people rather than supporting the representatives of the opposition.
So mixed signals and mixed emotions in Caracas. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That was senior analyst Phil Gunson of the International Crisis Group in Caracas. Thank you very much for your expertise.
Thank you.
Now, the leaders of other Latin American countries have also reacted to the strikes on Caracas. Argentinian President and Trump ally Javier Milei praised Maduro's capture, posting on X, "Long live freedom, damn it." The president of Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia, Gustavo Petro, condemned the U.S. intervention and immediately increased military presence along the border with Venezuela. The leaders of Mexico, Cuba, and Chile also took to social media to denounce the U.S. attacks and voice their concern. Now here in Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz has reacted to the U.S.'s intervention in Venezuela. On X, he said, "Nicolas Maduro has led his country into ruin. The most recent election was rigged. Like many other countries, we have therefore not recognized his presidency. Maduro has played a problematic role in the region." The legal assessment of the U.S. intervention is complex and requires careful consideration. International law remains the guiding framework. At this stage, political instability in Venezuela must be avoided. The objective is an orderly transition to an elected government.